Conocimiento de sí mismo. Constitución total del ser humano y cadena de vidas. Por Emilio Carilo.
Self-knowledge. Total constitution of the human being and chain of lives. For Emilio Carilo.
Hola, amigos.
Hello friends, my name is Emilio Carilo, and I'm delighted to share this meeting in this context of the 5th International Congress of Regressive Therapies, responding to the invitation made to me by the Spanish Association of Regressive Therapies through my good friend Carlos. So thank you very much, Carlos Gonzalez, and thank you very much, I repeat, to all of you for your presence. I do it online, but I am here in heart and soul, and for your attention, to share on a really exciting topic, which is the knowledge of oneself, something that sometimes we talk about, this knowledge of oneself, as if it were such a thing, but it has a depth. It's what I will modestly try to emphasize and summarize in a speech that, on the other hand, will logically respect the time limits set by the organization and therefore leads me to be very synthetic in my appreciations and in my sharing. Perhaps the first thing, my friends, is to point out that when we talk about self-knowledge, about knowing yourself, we are talking about a maxim that is part of what I like to call primordial wisdom or perimine wisdom. That is, a wisdom that comes from very far back and that has been configured throughout history as a sediment, as a possession of wisdom, of mastery, that precisely great soul, master soul, men and women have been making available to us. More specifically, if we mention precisely this knowing thyself, we find that already in the Bible, in one of its fundamental books of the beginning, which is Deuteronomy. Reference is already made precisely to this knowing thyself. In the Latin translation of the Bible, the term used is attendi tibi. Be attentive to yourself. Observe yourself. Look at yourself. And from there, we find this knowing thyself with great force in the teaching of the great philosophers of classical Greece. I would say that, although in some way we find this knowing thyself, we find it present in the Hermetic principles, for example, or in the wisdom of Eastern traditions, it is undoubtedly in classical Greek philosophy where it acquires a fundamental nature as a summons of consciousness and as a spiritual summons. And it's curious to remember that precisely back in the 6th century BC, the so-called 7 wise men of classical Greece took the initiative to promote the construction of a great temple near Athens, in the town of Delphi, about 30 kilometers from Athens, a temple in which to locate the oracle of the gods, an expression with which they wanted to refer to an enclosure where the priests and priestesses, nothing to do with what we understand today as a priest, in short, teachers, could make available to all who came to that enclosure a deep and genuine wisdom. And in the construction of that temple, which was dedicated to the god Apollo, in the entrance pronaos, in the entrance frontispiece of the temple, they placed, of course, logically, in classical Greek, this expression, know thyself. What a curious thing. This temple was a place of pilgrimage. History says that men and women, thirsty for the truth, came from many parts of the Mediterranean, and when they arrived there, what they found at the door, as an announcement of the most sacred, the most intimate, and perhaps the most fundamental thing they were going to find, is know thyself. Because you can see that even if we go today to our present time, and if we go to something much more cosmic than that temple dedicated to Apollo, to that oracle of the gods, if we go to a closer subject, but also, I repeat, more prosaic, as is the dictionary of the language, the dictionary of the Spanish Academy of the Language, when we go to the word conscience, With that conscience, we find precisely reflected the importance of know thyself. I think we all know that in Spanish there is a word that is conscience, without that, and another that is conscience, with that. The first one, conscience without S, the dictionary refers to mortal questions related to good and evil. For example, if I hurt someone, it could be that I have a bad conscience for the evil done. However, consciousness goes the other way, and we could say that it is much richer and much more fruitful from the spiritual point of view, and that consciousness with that, the dictionary tells us that it is a kind of compendium of three capacities. The first one, the knowledge of ourselves. That's where this know thyself comes in, the importance of knowing ourselves. Secondly, knowledge of the reality that surrounds us. One thing is not compatible with the other. I know myself, or I try to, and equally know the reality that surrounds us. And thirdly, balance. The balance between the inner look and the outer look. This is encompassed in the term consciousness. How important it would be to always remember this. When we often fall into diatribes, whether the consciential, the spiritual, whether to look inward, whether to look outward, and sometimes we go as if we were one-eyed. We do not cover the eye of the inner look, and we are always aware of what is outside, or vice versa. We pay much attention to what is outside, and yet we are not able to see ourselves to what is inside. In short, on many occasions, we go through life one-eyed, when the term conscience summons us to that balance between the inner look and the external look. And that inner look is precisely the foundation of knowing ourselves. Knowing yourself, therefore, even today in the dictionary, is linked to one's own conscience. Knowing yourself, therefore, even today in the dictionary, is linked to one's own conscience. Having said that, we could ask ourselves, what exactly does it consist of? When the great masters have spoken to us about knowing ourselves, and they are talking about something concrete, something very generic, something that can touch many areas, and something which we can summarize in some ways, the hardcore of what is the knowledge of oneself or of thyself, the answer is that there is no doubt that this knowledge of ourselves has a hard core. It has something very concrete and very specific, and of an enormous power, which has many derivations without any doubt, but which in itself is really fundamental of knowing ourselves. And it lies neither more nor less than in becoming aware and also knowing how to differentiate and know the interaction between essence and appearance. The realization that in us, in each one of us, in you, in me, there is an essence and there is an appearance. Also in the external world, also in that external reality, there is an appearance, which is what we see with the naked eye. But behind that appearance, there is an essence. But the knowledge of ourselves means becoming aware, I repeat, that in you and in me, there is an essence and an appearance, which are not at odds, which are complementary, but which we must know how to differentiate. Moreover, going back to the dictionary, in the Spanish language we have the advantage of using different verbs to refer to ser and estar. Ser and estar, as we all know, are two clearly differentiated verbs. This does not happen in other languages. For example, in English there is the same verb for both. The verb to be means ser and estar, and whether we know if it is one or the other depends on the context in which we are using the verb. This is not the case in Spanish. We have two perfectly differentiated verbs, and this helps us to understand much better what is essence and appearance, and therefore helps us to understand much better what is to know ourselves. We could say what we really are. Being, the permanent, the imperishable that is in each one of us. the imperishable essence. That is being. And being is where being is embodied in order to live the human experience. Being, as I have just shared, is the imperishable essence. Being, we could say, applied to ourselves, is the passing, perishable, ephemeral appearance. Very important, because without this perishable, passing and ephemeral appearance, we will not be able to experience what this human experience is. But certainly, the human being, when we contemplate him from this point of view, we could say that the doors are opened to a great truth, a perfect conjunction of ser and estar. Certainly, there is a concrete moment in our experiential unfolding when physical death occurs. Physical death supposes neither more nor less that end of being, the end of our state, in quotation mark, of appearance. But the being continues to be. The essence continues to be. The essence now and here, in me, for example, in this Emilio, but when this Emilio dies, which he will die, the being ends, the appearance ends, but the being that has incarnated in this being, the essence that has incarnated in this appearance, continues to be. That is the hardcore, I repeat, of knowing ourselves. To make it simpler, I like to share, obviously, in a colloquial way and as a joke, that since that temple dedicated to Apollo in Delphi, a lot of time has passed. I was commenting that it was built back in the 6th century BC, and it seems that this call to this convocation, to know ourselves, that was placed at the entrance fructifice, does not seem to be catching on with the people. People still believe as if they were on the margins of this wisdom and of this fundamental truth. Well, in a very colloquial way and as a joke, I like to say that perhaps, in the present times, if we rebuild the temple of Delphi, in that entrance pronounce, instead of putting back the expression know thyself, we should put something like, I repeat, allow me to joke, realize or become aware. Realize that it is driver and car. Let's see if that way, in some way, we can integrate ourselves. Being the car, the appearance, the being, to which I previously referred, that there is in each one of us, our little self and the personality associated with it, that is to say, the Emilio on duty, that is the car, and the driver is the essence, the being, that incarnates in the car to live the human experience. And as I said before, there is a certain moment when the car ends. The car ends its existential unfolding, but the driver continues to be. And from there, from this knowing ourselves, from this understanding of the human being as a perfect conjunction of essence and appearance, of ser and estar, of driver and car, the very traditions to which I referred earlier, this primordial or perennial wisdom has been deepening and has been giving us other enormously important keys. I think we have to go to that, what we're going into. After this kind of introduction, we are going to go into some details about what are the derivations and the direct implications of knowing yourselves in the terms that I have just exposed. But before doing so, I cannot resist emphasizing that at the moment we are living in, where there is a society where the transcendent is marginalized, as if it were ignored, as Friedrich Nietzsche said, at the border between the 19th and the 20th century, a society that has killed God through the character of the madman in the Gala science. God is dead and we have killed him, is what Nietzsche's madman says in the Gala science. This death of God obviously does not mean the strangling of a white-bearded lord who lives beyond Jupiter, but refers to the expulsion of the transcendent from personal and social life. This is what has been oppressing more and more until today, since Nietzsche already warned us about it. And when we effectively carry out this killing of God, we can even reach the limit that we are living today. where a philosophy, to call it somehow transhumanist, tries to convince us that the human being is the apparent, the being, the car, forgetting the essence of being, of the driver. And this transhumanist philosophy transforms, converts the human being into subhuman, because when a human being forgets his essence, forget that the driver identifies exclusively with the appearance, with the being, with the car, he is really denying himself and is becoming subhuman. I would say that at this moment, the great lesson and the great call to consciousness that knowing yourself makes is not to fall into this transhumanist that simply transforms us into subhuman. And having said that, as I was pointing out a moment ago, I think it is worthwhile to go into the derivations and implications of knowing yourself. And these derivations and implications, I think we should begin by making a brief reference to how this knowledge of ourselves as essence and appearance has been reflected throughout the centuries, precisely because of these great masters who have been shaping this great wisdom that has been with us for a long time and that is also with us today. Concretely, if we go, for example, to the Christian tradition, in the letters of Paul, I believe that specifically in the letter to the Thessalonians, we are told precisely from the knowledge of ourselves, differentiating between essence and appearance in the terms that I have exposed. We are told that the human being is body, soul, and spirit. Body, soul, and spirit. Notice that the body encompasses everything that is the appearance, everything that is the estar, everything that is the car. And in relation to the essence, to the ser, to the driver, we differentiate two components, soul and spirit. This contribution of Christianity, I repeat, is textually taken from one of Paul's letters. We find it before in Greek philosophy, in the Pythagorean Academy, in the works of Plato, etc. We are taught that the human being is body, psyche, and pneuma, terms that come to say something very similar to what is reflected in the aforementioned letter of Paul. And a little after Paul, in the Latin philosophical tradition, the great philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius again stresses the same point and tells us that the human being is body, psyche, and pneuma. It is like beginning to delve into this knowledge of ourselves, not just staying in the differentiation between essence and appearance, but going down a little further and analyzing the traditions that are being developed mainly from the 7th and 8th century BC. We can see, for example, that in the Albaita tradition, we are told of 5 components, not only 3. Body, soul and spirit, but we are told of 5 components when it comes to expressing, when we enter into this knowledge of ourselves. Realize that in you there are 5 components. They are not watertight compartments. They interact with each other. But be careful. There are different components that, I repeat, the Albaita tradition includes in 5. If we study the Kabbalah, it depends on the Kabbalah master, let's call it that way, on the moment of the Kabbalistic tradition we go to, we find the same as in the Albaita tradition. 5 components, or even 6. Notice that this realizing in the knowledge of ourselves, that there are in each one different components. It's very important. I repeat, knowing that it does not mean that they are watertight compartments. They interact with each other. But although they interact with each other, they are different, and this is very interesting. To give an example that we all understand, when we talk about a human being getting sick, we're not satisfying with saying that the human being has become ill. But it's about knowing where the disease lies. If it's in the kidneys, if it's in the lungs, it is relevant to know the different components of our physical constitution to then give the appropriate treatment to that component that is sick. Well, saving the difference and changing the scale, we could say that the knowledge of ourselves through our different components teaches us which are the same, and from there, as it's about living not only in health, but also in harmony and even, that is to say, the great embodiment of our spirituality in fullness and in state of uncaused happiness, which does not depend on the outside, but depends on ourselves. To move forward on this path, it is very important to perceive each of these components, to balance, to harmonize, so that each of them fructify properly. And to conclude these implications, derivations, from the point of view of the components of the knowledge of ourselves, we must point out that if I have spoken of Christianity, of Greek philosophy, of Latin philosophy, of the Albaite tradition, of the Kabbalah, without any doubt, there is a tradition that has abounded the most in this knowledge of ourselves and of the different components that reside in the human being, different from each other and interacting among them, one of which is imperishable and the other ephemeral. I refer to the tradition that has been given the name of the septenary constitution of the human being. In this tradition, in this wisdom, the approach to the knowledge of ourselves shows that in each of us there are 7 great components, of which 4 are perishable, that is, they are part of the car, and there are 3 that are imperishable, that is, they are part of the driver, of our essence, of our true being. This septenary constitution has been reflected for a long time in traditions that come from very far back. For example, to give a sample button known to all, it is the support of the science of yoga. This great science, when it makes such a deep analysis of human psychology and calls for a harmonization of the human being to advance in the conscious and spiritual steps, precisely as its raison d'être, has its foundation in the septenary constitution. There are, for example, when we refer to the different stages of yoga, today sometimes we talk about them as different techniques of yogas, although really yoga is one, what the great master Pandajali called Raja Yoga. When we analyze each one of these stages, when we analyze each one of these components, the septenary constitution is as a backdrop. Now, I will make some more remarks about this. But before doing so, I would like to summarize what is this perception that the septenary constitution gives us, which tells us, in short, my friends, that in the human being, in you and me, in order for us to know ourselves, we must keep in mind that there are 4 perishable and 3 non-perishable components. What are the perishable components? I think we have been able to talk about most, if not all, of them. The physical body, without any doubt. Secondly, the etheric or energetic body, that is, the realization that underneath the physical, so to speak, as a support of our physical reality, there is an energetic reality, which is taken into account, for example, when we practice therapeutic touch, which is currently called Reiki, or when acupuncture is practiced. The needles are not just stuck in the epidermis, but not in any part of it, but in places that are known to be energetic enclaves. That underneath the epidermis, there is not only a physical body, but there is an energetic essence. Likewise, the nadis that yoga talks about, the circulation of energy, the chakras, have a lot to do with this etheric or energetic body. And together with the physical body and the etheric or energetic body, our emotional world and our mental world. An emotional world that, therefore, we are taught in the septenary constitution, is interrelated with the physical body, but it is different. Something that is sometimes forgotten. Sometimes it seems as, or we understand as, if the emotional world and the physical world were the same. And no, there is an interaction between them, but they are very different. Good proof of which is that when we have great emotional turbulence that does not heal, that we are not able to harmonize it, to balance our emotional world by doing physical exercise or going to the gym, right? it is sometimes different, because the emotional world is different from the physical world, and as I said, along with the physical body, the etheric body, and our emotional sphere, our mental sphere. In addition, the septenary constitution, and in this yoga delves especially, it becomes clear that it has two levels, the so-called lower mind and the higher mind. Both belong to the mental plane, but having that characteristic of belonging to the same, they are different. Because the lower mind, what some psychologists call today the concrete mind, deals with the ordinary, the everyday, the routine, precisely why it's always in operation. It's not necessary to turn it on, because when dealing with the ordinary, it's always on. Of course, it has the disadvantage that we do not know where the button to turn it off is. And it is otherwise sometimes in what Saint Teresa of Jesus called the mad woman of the house, the great Parla in China, right? And along with this concrete mind, our mental plane has also a higher mind, which is what some psychologists nowadays call the abstract mind. It is there at our disposal so that, if we want, by bringing into our life transcendent issues, the abstract mind can deal with those transcendent issues. If we do not bring into our life transcendent issues, the abstract mind is like turned off, and the more we use it, the more it expands. By the way, when we bring into our life transcendent issues, issues that have to do with consciousness, with philosophy, with spirituality, everything that has to do with the scientific, everything that has to do with the artistic, with the creative, with inspiration, with institution, with intuition, when a human being brings these types of questions into his life, even if he does not realize it, he is no longer in concrete mind mode, but in abstract mind mode. And these components that I have just said, with its two levels on concrete mind and abstract mind, is the embodiment that the sectarian constitution gives us of what the human being is, from its transitory and ephemeral components. And together with this quaternary, which as it is transient and ephemeral, in the sectarian constitution is called the inferior quaternary, there is a superior trinary in the human being, which is called superior because it is not ephemeral, it is not transient, it is imperishable. It is what is really permanent. It is the essence. It is our being. And notice that it speaks of three. That is precisely why it is called trinary, because it speaks of three. We were saying that in the Christian tradition, in the Greek tradition, in the Latin tradition, we speak of soul and spirit, right? Also in the Eastern tradition, we speak of Atma and Buddhi. The sectarian constitution is further refined to bring out something that is very important. It speaks of spirit, universal soul and differentiated soul, which is also called casual body. This has an enormous wisdom, and of course it is beyond my scope at this moment to go into details about it, but we could say that the spirit is the presence of the divine in all of us, in that primordial wisdom, in that perennial wisdom, which I mentioned before. We are told that that which has no origin is the origin of all that originates. And being the origin of all that originates, it is present and immanent in all that originates. That is the denomination given in that ancient wisdom to what the dictionary of the Academy today calls God. We were told, do not include divinity in a concept, because then somehow we are making it too human. And that we speak of that without going into further specifications. And it says, I have postulated, I repeat, that that which has no origin is the origin of everything originated and is present and immanent in everything originated. That immanent, underlying presence is the Spirit. That Spirit, that divine essence that St. John of the Cross called it, That is in all human being. I would say that in all forms of life, in everything originated. But of course, for the spirit to fit with its high vibration, with its vibrational qualities, to fit in matter, to fit in the form of life, it needs a kind of intermediary. That intermediary is the soul. That intermediary is the soul. I also like to say that it's like a submarine, the ones that humans use to go deeper into the marine world. If it wasn't for the probe, if it wasn't for this submarine, we would not be able to descend. We would be incompatible with being, for example, 1500 meters deep. On the other hand, thanks to this probe, thanks to this submarine, we can go down, we can know those realities, we can take samples, we can take videos through the spotlight and the camera that the submarine have. We could say, obviously saving the distance, and as a mere simile, that the soul is like the submarine that the spirit uses to be able to descend to the material realities and incarnate. Saint John of the Cross himself said it really well. The soul, and at its center, the spirit. And that soul is one, so to speak. What happens is that afterwards, that soul, which is one, has ramifications. It is as if the tree had many leaves, and each leaf has its own experience. Because in each tree, each leaf has its own experience of water, of rain, of nesting or not of birds, of presence or not of insects. And we could say that the universal soul has an evolutionary ramification, and those soul leaves are the differentiated soul that incarnate in the human being. The human being possesses an individualized soul, a differentiated soul. The superior trinary of the sectarian constitution, this is what it teaches us. In the human being, in you and in me, from the point of view of the essence, from the point of view of being, there is the spirit, the soul, which uses the spirit as a whisker to be able to incarnate, and in the specific case of each human being, there is a kind of ramification of that universal soul, which is a differentiated soul, which incarnates, which is the one that incarnates, which is projected and incarnated in each human being. Now, friends, and this is very important for us to bear in mind, when we say that an individualized, differentiated soul incarnates, the experience of the soul is not a single incarnation, but a chain of incarnation, a succession of incarnation, a chain of lives, we would call it. A chain of lives that is not casual, but has a deep reason for being. It is a chain of life aimed at that leaf soul to gain in self-consciousness, so that the leaf soul gains wisdom, so to speak, so that the soul really becomes the vehicle that allows the spirit, the divine essence that we all have, to become present and manifest itself. And for this, the soul has to take some shapes. It has to have an evolutionary process, which is what is achieved. So everything that the traditions teach us in this regard is what is achieved, or should be achieved, what the incarnations of the souls are called. Notice that in chapter 25 of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus Christ gives us a metaphor to understand the evolution of the soul. Christ Jesus speaks to us about the oil lamp and tells us that when we incarnate, we are called to pour oil into the lamp. We may or may not pour it. And obviously, pouring oil into the lamp means that we have to harvest oil to be able to pour it into the lamp. That with our practice of life, with our dynamic of life, we have to harvest something from which we can take oil. If our life dynamics, our conducts, our behavior are based on selfishness, egocentrism, materialism, etc., this does not serve to extract oil. We could say that with this type of behavior, we are sowing stones, and from stones we cannot extract oil. On the other hand, when our conducts, our behaviors are getting a little bit closer to our best version, to being good people, to having a more supportive, more cooperative, more empathetic, compassionate, a more loving way of going through life, and this is reflected in our daily life, then we are sowing that from which we can extract oil. And the evolutionary dynamic would consist precisely in that, in life practices, which in successive incarnation makes it possible for us to extract oil, which is what allows the soul to evolve in self-consciousness. We also find this very beautifully, for example, in the work of Plato. Going back again to the classical Aelian philosophy, in that wonderful book that is the Republic of Plato, which gathers his dialogues with his master, with Socrates. At the very end of the Republic, we are mentioned, in great details, by the way, a near-death experience, that of an Armenian soldier named who apparently has died in battle, but then he has not died. And when he comes back to life, has had a NDE, what we call today a near-death experience, which is collected in great details in Plato's The Republic. And in that near-death experience, there is even a fact that in the NDEs that we know today is not usual, and that even reaches in the NDE beyond the so-called tunnel of light, and he reaches the plane of light. And within the plane of light, he even reaches the place, the stadium, the space, where the souls that have disincarnated and that are in that plane of light are ready to reincarnate. They are again ready to reincarnate, to undertake a new human experience. And there is a kind of priestess, a teacher, who is the thesis, who tells those souls, she calls them passing souls, and she tells them passing souls, you are going to reincarnate. The format you have chosen, the experience, so to say, the context, right, of the father, of the mother, therefore the socio-economic situation, etc., etc., you have chosen it. But never forget that virtue will be within your reach. Whether you make it yours or not depends only on you, passing souls. Whether you make virtue yours or not depends only on you, because God is innocent. We could say that these expressions of Plato's work of the Republic frames very well, linking it with the oil lamp we were talking about before, the fact of the reincarnating. It is a new opportunity for us to evolve, for our souls to gain in consciousness, and we gain in consciousness when we pour oil into the lamp. That is, in Plato's language, when we make our virtue in our practice of life, and we are able, even if modestly, to carry it out. I would like you, my friends, to reflect for a moment on the importance of this septenary way of knowing ourselves. I was talking earlier about yoga. In yoga, for example, when reference is made to the first and second stages of Raja Yoga, many of you know, lama, ni lama, things that we should prune from our life and things that we should introduce in our lives, reference is being made to the emotional world. Interestingly, the science of yoga begins by calling us about the importance of harmonizing, balancing, calming our emotional components. Then, in the stages of yoga, come asanas, physical exercises, to put it in a very colloquial way, that have to do with the physical body, so that our physical body is also in shape, so that we live in health, with plasticity, and so on. Then comes pranayama, the fourth stage of Raja Yoga, lama, ni lama, asana, and pranayama. Pranayama has to do fundamentally with breathing, not very much linked to vitality, to the etheric body, to our etheric body being effectively with vitality. This influences our state of mind when facing each day. It is not one of the great repercussions that the etheric body has on us. And if we continue studying this science of yoga, we enter already later in pratyahara, which is a kind of balance, of harmonization of our emotional world again, to which we referred before, and of our mental world. And finally, we enter in the superior stages of yoga, Sanyama, Dhyana, Dharana, Samadhi, that is to say, meditation, concentration, contemplation, and samadhi, which serves to educate our mind to the point of reaching a state, the state of samadhi, where the mind, perfectly educated, we would say that this can only be reached with the use and expansions of the abstract mind, to which we referred earlier. And we even reach an educational state of the mind, where the mind, at the will of yoga and at the will of the meditator, ceases to be self-present. That mind, that in our day-to-day life becomes self-present, and educating it through the science of yoga, we get that self-presence does not occur, and the disappearance of the self-presence of the mind allows access to those states of the samadhi that Teresa of Jesus called ecstasy, or St. John of the Cross called state of high contemplation. The science of yoga, therefore, as I pointed out before, has as its backdrop the septenary constitution of the human being. And it is also curious because when today we know through science the reality that surrounds us, we can see the septenary pattern that is in the raison d'être of the septenary constitution. The septenary pattern is the language of life. Today, we know, for example, that within what we call matter there are atoms, right? And we know that inside the atoms there are neutrons and protons that make up the nucleus, and around them the electrons, and depending on the level of rotation, closer or further away from the electrons, the different types of matter are formed, the different types of atoms, and therefore of molecules and matter, in what, in science, in physics, are called atomic levels, which characterize one type of matter or another. Well, today we know that those atomic levels, as if they were planets rotating around a south, which are around the nucleus and the atom, are or can be conformed in a maximum of 7, no more and no less, in a maximum of 7. There can be atoms of atomic level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but the maximum is 7. Although the sectarian pattern intrinsically defined for us the reality of matter. We see this also in the chemical elements, the periodic table of the elements. It is called periodic precisely because the chemical elements are classified according to a pattern, also the sectarian pattern. Today, when we know what are the waves that make up the so-called spectrum, we know that there are different types of waves, not only the ones we see as expected, but there are also X-rays, gamma rays, etc. Well, we know that there are 7 types of waves, no more and no less. We go back to 7. And even in something we all know as in the musical language, the famous musical octave, has the septenary pattern because it begins with a C, and the 8th component, which is the C, again the C, is already the first of the new scale. That is to say, that somehow this wisdom to which we are making reference since a long time ago intuited that the septenaries is the best way to know ourselves. Let's not stay in the analysis of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's go further. We are going to analyze in us, we are going to see in us 7 components. Why? Because the sectarian pattern is the language of life. So we are going to apply it to us. And by applying it to us, this sectarian constitution is formulated, which obviously has been reflected by great authors throughout history, and where both my good friend Carlos and myself like to advise an author called Taimi, Ika Taimi, and where we talk about Ika Taimi, especially a book that has a reason of being precisely, or as a title, the knowledge of oneself, of the renewal of oneself, where in detail, this person of a deep spirituality, disembodied in 1979, but being of a deep spirituality, he was a great scientist in India, professor of physics and professor of chemistry, he teaches us very well about the sectarian constitution. And also, my friends, he emphasizes the chain of lives of our imperishable component. That is to say, the lower quaternary, what I call the car, is different in each life, but the upper trinary, when our lower quaternary dies, our being, our car, the driver remains. And as it has been reflected very well in Plato's Passing Souls, it incarnates again. So in you and in me, the imperishable is not the first time it incarnates. That almost spiritual dimension, the oil lamp that is the soul, and in its center the spirit, it's not the first time it incarnates. We can ask ourselves, why do we not remember the past incarnations? This is what is called, in the great traditions, the great forgetfulness. Well, very simple, friends. We do not remember because if we would remember, without being spiritually evolved enough, we would remember all the past incarnations. We would not live this incarnation. We would remain as if blocked in the memory of everything we have experienced, everything we have been, everything we have lived through, possibly, as Ramon P said in his work, many lives, many masters. The great forgetfulness has its reason to be. But be careful, there is a memory in the oil. Because the soul, when it incarnates with the level of oil and does not lose it. It is gained in its experience of previous incarnations. And also, even those experiences are in us, in what, in the language of psychology, is called the reminiscence, which enters, which moves between the conscious and the unconscious, and that reminiscence allows us to be able to access those memories of past lives when we are in conditions of it. In that sense, Patanjali, in his own work on yoga, tells us clearly that when we are evolving spiritually, the box of the memory of past lives is opening in a natural way, not forced by the spiritual evolution itself. And when we talk about regressive therapies in relation to past lives, it is important on many occasions, without forcing the machine, obviously, knowing that the box will be opening naturally. But sometimes, how important is a regressive therapy when it is, for example, that a person perceives that he is much more than the car? I have known many friends that this perception of past lives has helped them to understand that one thing is the driver and another is the car. And when these therapies open their path, it also helps us to understand much better what we really are. Because it may be that in these reminiscences there are some components. It is what the Eastern tradition called karma, that somehow in presence in our life, karma is not a punishment. Karma is for us to know how to manage as a stone in the shoe that we bring from previous lives. And often having knowledge, thanks to this type of regressive therapies, of what those stones are, help us to carry out the management of them, to dissolve it. It's precisely the purpose of karma, that these stones appear in our life to be able to manage them from the consciousness and not carry it loaded. In short, I conclude, my friends, the septenary constitution of the human being reflects us in a complete way and reflects what is that knowledge of ourselves that is fundamental in our day-to-day, and it's essential that we carry it to live more fully and in greater harmony. Not only from our perishable components, but also, most importantly, from what we really are and from our permanent and imperishable part. Thank you very much for your attention. A big hug.